Wominjika, everyone. Welcome. We're very happy to be in this beautiful space, and thank you all for coming. It's just so lovely to see faces and be in this amazing space. My name's Christine Phillips. I'm an architect and an academic from the RMIT Architecture program.
And I'm Lewis Telly, and I am an RMIT Architecture graduate and very excited to welcome you all here tonight.
So tonight we are bringing you a discussion that will explore the relationship between image making and city making, and in particular the role of social media and architecture. And what is that role? What is the good, the bad, and the ugly on social media in relation to architecture? What role should architects play? How can we begin to curate our spaces and understand what the implications of social media are? And these are questions that Lewis Nuccitelli began to explore through his RMIT Architecture major project thesis back in 2018 that I supervised. And as I was saying to my fellow panelists, Lewis was a bit of a SAR student. Now, for those of you who haven't undertaken an architecture degree, the major project is your final semester of a Masters of Architecture program, and it is where you get to explore ideas that you feel are relevant, and it's a self-driven project. And Lewis did an amazing project called Beyond the Selfie. So we are both very excited to be extending the conversation of that design research with this great panel, a diverse panel that includes Liam Young, who is joining us from LA at an ungodly hour. Hi, Liam, thank you for joining us. Nicola Cortese, and Lau, Rory Hyde, and we will formally introduce them all very soon.
Thank you, Christine, and I'll jump on here as well. Before we start as well, Design Week is a program that connects people across Australia and internationally, and we want to give our thanks to First Nations communities and acknowledge their continued connection to the lands that we operate on. We acknowledge and pay our respects to all First Nations elders, past, present and emerging, who look after the land and water that we live and work on every day, that have allowed us to share these ideas and tell our stories. We'd like to make special mention of the Boon Wurrung and Woiwurrung Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, whom we reside in their countries respectively. It's an honour to be here tonight. Okay, so breathe. This day has come, and we are standing here on stage at the amazing Captiol Theatre, designed by Walter Burley Griffin in the early 20th century and refurbished by 6 Degrees architects. I cannot think of a more suitable venue for this conversation to take place, famously photographable and truly iconic. In 2018, I completed my Masters of Architecture at RMIT University, and what an incredible journey that was. My thesis project, by the same title of this 2022 Melbourne Design Week event, Beyond the Selfie, both questioned and embraced the impact that social media has had on architecture. With a deep interest in the disruption social media has on our daily lives, and a love for pop culture, design, and anything in between, it was only fitting that I spent my final semester at RMIT finding a way to integrate these thoughts into my architectural studies. What at times felt directionless and cringe turned into a project that would become relevant and timely. To paint the picture of where this all began, let's wind the clock back a little bit and paint the scene. It's 2014, Bumble has just entered the dating app market, the Malaysia Airlines flight MH370 has vanished, and after 2 years in the charts, the K-pop single Gangnam Style reaches 2 billion views on YouTube. Also in 2014 though, Ellen DeGeneres produced one of the most influential photographs in the entertainment industry with her Ellen Selfie, which was retweeted more than 3 million times, and still sits in the top 5 most tweeted images ever. It was a moment created for the celebrity-saturated internet age, so much so that Ellen literally broke the social media platform Twitter. And for a moment, the importance of the event they were at was completely forgotten. The prestigious and well-known Oscars in its 86th year was put aside, and amongst all the media reports and internet journalism, headlines were less focused on Lupita Nyong'o becoming the 15th black actor to win an Oscar, and more focused on the selfie that stopped the globe. This is the power that social media has in our society. The ability to disrupt, to skew perceptions, and to alter thoughts. We find ourselves fawning over the lives of people that we have never met, places we may never visit, and comparing ourselves and comparing our own worth to an image that sits within 5 by 5 inches on our mobile phone screen. Now you may be thinking, how does this relate to architecture? Well, it does and it doesn't. Social media often gives a shallow view of a person, a place, or a building. We're most likely presented with the shiny picture, the final product, missing the process and mistakes that took place along the way. It is this concept of perception versus reality that I was interested in, and that's how we reached the beginning of my project. Rather than only questioning, Beyond the Selfie embraced our perception of a city through the lens of social media. If we could never visit a city again, how would we imagine it? Well, in the spirit of time travel, let's fast forward 4 years, and this became our reality. Now, while this will not be a conversation that discusses the pandemic, much to everyone's delight, never could have I imagined that what would precede this project would be a time where we moved entirely online and a flight to Paris was limited to searching the geotag on Instagram or doom scrolling TikTok into the early hours of the morning. So before I introduce the incredible panel that sits to the right of me, please let me present to you my 2018 project titled Beyond the Selfie. Social media has inherently allowed us to create cities outside the realm of our reality. These are cities which are manifested through a series of images, videos, and documentaries. Cities were places once only imagined through stories and first-hand experiences, but now imagined through a patchwork of imagery given to people others than ourselves. Quietly humming in our pockets as we live out our days, the world sits online. Mindlessly, we share content of our first-hand experiences in a city or a landscape and broadcast our privacy while the rest of the world uses this content to imagine a place beyond their means. We carry multiple cities in our pockets at one time, populated by the views of people that we may never know. We walk through one place while we scroll through another, and with a quick glimpse at our facial ID, we can unlock the keys to Paris and New York. To this we can ask ourselves, if we have never been somewhere firsthand, then whose city are we viewing? What happens beyond the selfie? Is a new city imagined through social media, one where takeaway cups and coffee and street art become the foreground of our city, where neon bar signs and mural walls are now the way we identify a place. We are no longer focused on what program lies within a building, but how good it can make us look. The Grand Library now becomes a backdrop in a perfect square until almost unrecognizable, where we hashtag history and hashtag culture, but we don't venture inside to find out why and how it is hashtag historical. We end our journey with architecture before it has begun. So here we arrive. This is where the project begins. I'm interested in what happens beyond the selfie, in the after, outside of the 5 by 5 inch square, where we are all actors and the city is our stage, social media is our global theatre. Our cities become a backdrop in a daily sitcom. Think of the 290 plus million people that form their view of Los Angeles through the lens of Kim Kardashian daily. With the assortment of images provided, one can rearrange and modify a city in a single hour. Take Melbourne, for example. With the aid of social media, we can quickly rearrange the city so that Luna Park is next to Flinders Street Station, and within the National Gallery of Victoria sits 40 bars illuminated by neon signs. My project is a reassemblage of Melbourne as a unified whole, a cultural quilt of what is deemed Instagrammable. And rather seeing it as a problem, I've attempted to use it as a tool to curate an architecture that places the familiar in an unfamiliar setting, and seeing if its purpose and original meaning can be something entirely new. We find intrigue in whether the past can inform the future. And so I began by modelling a taxonomy of either elements of buildings or objects that are frequently photographed in Melbourne. In 2018, based on a data analysis, this consisted of the likes of the NGV entrance and water wall, the Luna Park mouth, the Lonely For You Only neon sign at Chin Chin, as well as Melbourne Cafe, Coffee, and the State Library. When we are presented with only fragments, can these exist in conjunction, and what is the outcome? In early tests, I presented the imagined reality of what might happen beyond one selfie. What is the spatial quality when architecture is merely a backdrop? The coffee cup in the foreground becomes the architecture, while the building rests behind, arranged like a stage set for the benefit of one's picture, retractable and once no longer required. I chose to interrogate my project upon City Square, which is currently still under construction for the CBD South Metro Tunnel site. The proposal aims to return the square to its former space for gathering events, but I believe the city deserves more than the expanse of crushed rock to circulate through. My goal was to design a new city square that is for the inhabitants of the city, a collective memory of what we encounter on the day-to-day, a real-life Melbourne theatre. I selected 3 key vantage points to assemble an anamorphic projection upon. An anamorphic projection depicts a space or an object as whole, only when viewed from a certain vantage point, otherwise seen as broken pieces, such as what you can see in this plan. Through collage and 3D modelling, I then reassembled the fragments of Melbourne as a whole, and so here I present to you the perfect picture. This is your selfie. In presenting the 3 key views, these are the constructed images, the moments where we stop and take our image, where all the photographable fragments are placed together. The linework images you see present the vantage point where one creates their picture. These are the moments within the perfect square, the architecture seems whole, and the fragments are together. In looking at these views, I've presented each scene under construction, constantly being retouched and maintained in order to provide the perfect picture. But now as we step away, we can see the fragments. Pictured in isometric, I present to you the broken pieces. We look beyond. As one moves away from the vantage point where the picturesque amalgamates, the image loosens, it pushes, and it pulls. A more porous and less unified building is revealed. The image is no longer shiny and finished, which suggests a complete building. The fragments now exist individually. Beyond, I ask, have you been here before? Where did it come from? Why do I know this place? Well, welcome to the Melbourne Theatre. Beyond the selfie focuses on the moments after the constructed view. What happens when we put our phone back in our pocket? We curate scenes within the daily sitcom. I finish now with the story of the new city square. Image 1. One poor girl awaits her Tinder date, but does she know she's at the wrong Young and Jackson, who is really getting stood up? Elvis Presley plays faintly in the background. James celebrates his 10th anniversary. And as the sun sets over Melbourne, for a minute, everything is perfect, and I can't help falling in love with you. Image 3. The new Flinders Lane steps proving to be a great spot for Danielle and Holly to escape Friday night drinks. After yet another failed attempt to kiss the boss's son, Genevieve walked past with Hugo. Image 4. Between the bluestone walls, the gallery bar reminds Elle of her first date with Matt at Siglo Bar. The metal sheathing feels like home amongst the busy peak hour of Swanston Street as the Magpie swoops in. Image 5, rather than being filled in, the iconic Melbourne toilets rise from the ground. Not filled in, but celebrated, for all to use. Why did we ever lose them? Image 6, Bella returns home from Sydney and basks in the rare Melbourne sun. Years after the marriage bill is passed, our city is beautiful. Image 7, Paul smiles, but just for a minute, as he catches the last rays of sun before returning to the grip of the coffee machine, sheltered by the stained coupe glass and the warmth of the concrete wall. Image 8, Sienna has another modafinil outside the permanently closed newsstand before she returns to work for an 11 p.m. finish. Why did I choose this career? She screams internally. Image 9, behind the scenes today, Pellegrini's or an espresso bar. Can't wait to read this cover story in the Vogue spring issue. Loving the new walkthrough. Image 10, Giselle visits us from Paris, but little does she know she stands upon the Ode to Vault, Ron Robertson Swan sculpture that once sat below. Image 11, John and Frank take a break from their 100th game of solitaire to look down on the millennials swapping solitaire for Twitter. And finally, image 12, up top through the paper-thin facades, Up top through the paper-thin facades, Virginia frames the spires of Melbourne's rooftops. What a day in the most amazing city. So what happens beyond your selfie? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all. So let's get straight into it. 4 years on, and I'm sure you've all treated yourself to some late night scrolling through restaurants in Paris, architecture in Mexico, or the crystal blue waters of the Mediterranean, before your phone screen locks and you're transported back to the 4 empty walls of your kitchen. Equally, I'm sure you have used social media as a platform to generate awareness, spark a discussion, or engage with a community group. We use social media as a tool in every aspect of our daily lives, whether it be for dating, activism, communication, or business. Tonight we will discuss, though, the impact that social media has specifically on the architectural profession, whether or not it can be used as a tool in the architectural design process to offer hopeful alternatives for our future physical cities. Joining us tonight is our incredible panel, who I could not be more proud to share a stage with. And starting with our guest on screen, currently in LA joining us tonight, is Liam Young. Liam is a designer, director, and BAFTA-nominated producer who operates in the spaces between design, fiction, and futures. Described by the BBC as the man designing our futures, his visionary films and speculative worlds are both extraordinary images of tomorrow and urgent examinations of the environmental questions that are facing us today. As a world builder, he visualizes the cities, spaces, and props of our imaginary futures for the film and television industry. And with his own films, he has premiered with platforms ranging from Channel 4, Apple+, SXSW, Tribeca, the New York Metropolitan Museum, the Royal Academy, Venice Biennale, the BBC, and The Guardian. His films have been collected internationally by museums such as the New York Met, Art Institute of Chicago, the Victoria and Albert Museum, the National Gallery of Victoria, and has been acclaimed in both mainstream and design media, including features with TED, Art, Canal+, Time Magazine, and many more. I'm so excited to welcome Liam to the panel this evening with a breadth of knowledge and someone that uses forms of media such as visual arts and film and fiction to imagine new futures. I can't wait to discuss where social media fits into this elaborate toolkit. So welcome, Liam.
We would also like to welcome Dr. Rory Hyde, who I've known for a while now. We used to do a little radio show together called The Architects that we co-hosted along with Simon Knott and Stuart Harrison on Triple R. Dr. Rory Hyde is a designer, a curator, an educator and a writer. His work is focused on new forms of design practice for the public good and redefining the role of the architect today. Dr. Hyde is an Associate Professor of Architecture, of Curatorial Design and Practice at the University of Melbourne, a design advocate for the Mayor of London and a member of City of Melbourne's Design Review Panel. From 2013 to 2020, he was the curator of contemporary architecture and urbanism at the Victoria and Albert Museum, a very significant role, and he's also very well known for his writing on architecture and the future of design practice, has been featured in various newspapers and journals, including The Economist, The Guardian, Harvard Design Magazine, Domus and Icon, and he is the author of Future Practice, Conversations from the Edge of Architecture, which is a very popular book, and a co-editor of his most recent book, Architects After Architecture, Alternative Pathways for Practice, something I'm very interested in, which was published in 2021. Welcome, Rory.
Thanks, Christine.
We would also like to welcome up Anne Lau, who is a very good friend of ours at the RMIT Architecture program. She's one of the design directors at Hayball, working collectively with her design colleagues, leading the practice's vision, ethos, and building a culture of design for Hayball's national practice. She's an interdisciplinary practitioner working across design, architecture, and urbanism, and her passion is to work in synergy with the project team and client in thinking and listening through a research-led approach. She brings unbiased scrutiny to define and clarify a project's vision. With 2.5 decades of working experience in Australia, Europe, China, Southeast Asia, and a career history of working in practices in Australia, the UK, all over the shop, along with design, education, and critique, which have played an essential role in her practice. She believes that teaching enriches and complements architectural practice, and I have first-hand experience of seeing that, and hones the architect's sense of empathy, the ability to listen, communicate, and collaborate, which are crucial in bringing designers with the end users to develop a meaningful project legacy that endures and benefits society. Welcome, Anne.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you.
And last but most definitely not least is Nicola Cortese. Nicola is a registered architect, a marketing and communications manager at Neo Metro, an educator for both RMIT University and Melbourne School of Design, and a co-founder of Caliper Journal. Her interest lies in architecture's potential to function more broadly as an interdisciplinary tool that can facilitate research and produce shared knowledge. She explores this cross-disciplinary approach by questioning the intersection of spatial design practices and other means of communication such as publishing and curating. Recently, alongside longtime collaborators and good friends Stephanie Parnas and Lauren Crockett, she co-designed and curated the incredible reading space, The Common Room, a reading room and library that was located at ACCA as part of the recent exhibition, Who's Afraid of Public Space? Thank you, Nicola, and welcome.
Yay.
All right, let us come and join and take a seat down here. Thank you, everyone, for listening to the welcome there. So we might just jump straight in because that was a lot of me talking and I think we should hear someone else's voice. But Anne, I'm going to start with you if we can. I'd like to begin by asking you a question around the implications of sharing ideas frequently and easily via social media. As one of the directors at Hayball Architecture, Can you talk through the positive or negative impact that social media has had on architectural practice? And do you think the various platforms give an accurate view of what goes on behind the scenes?
Right. Thank you for the first questions. Well, first of all, there's no doubt that as a practice too is everyone is on social media, and there's also a policies within the practice that deals with social media officially. At the same time, there are also the individual lives of everybody. I think the social media in terms of for the individuals who work as part of the community of the practice is the multiple voices, the debate, and the discussions that comes in. Using an internal platform too is there are lots and lots of transactions of informations, news, sharing, the generosity of sharings, anything from food, a sense of the work that we do, the things that affect our projects, examples that we should be sharing, as well as some personal interests as well. That's probably more of the private sharings. And then in terms of the common sharings of work is how do we project ourselves as a practice, as a collective, to communicate to the outside world as a community of architectural practice, and how to actually describe how we think and the process of how we think via the projects. Hopefully it will be beyond an image, but also talk about the intangible elements that goes into projects as well. So but the scales is from a tiny through to much larger.
And just to expand on that, Anne, do you think social media helps to communicate the broader ideas and intent of the practice? Because, I mean, I refer back to very well-known architect Robin Boyd, who used to constantly try to communicate what we actually do in architecture and what our role is. And I wonder if you are finding social media to actually help educate the broader public and communicate the broader ideas of the practice beyond just sort of a marketing exercise, and how valuable that is.
Yes, perhaps it's best to say too is it's interesting too is the idea of marketing and the language you use for marketing is very different from the language that you would use for design communications or critique. And I think it is important to actually recognize the different languages that one's use. Interestingly enough is just by our personal post, we keep all the data of the official site. And it's interesting to see the data that comes back with response of like or dislike. Usually it's like, the thousands of likes. We have approximately 12,000 followers. And it's also interesting too, is one of the most, and we talk about projects as well, and we talk about how we actually visit the site, we celebrate projects. But what is interesting too is one of the particular, it's a young child who talk about an experience of being in a small space. She's a young child. She's a daughter of one of our leaders in Sydney. She mentioned the experience of being there, and in fact, it's so real. The voice is so uncritical, but it comes with an honesty. She said that nooks and crannies are nice because I can enjoy it like a cat, and they enjoy having fun, and they enjoy the comfort. It's comfortable, it's cozy, it is a safe place, like a den. It's also great because you don't have to move around a lot and have all your toys and food in one place. I think adults don't use nooks as often because when they hear the words work, they think no fun. What was interesting is that this sense of honesty and non-promotional voices actually attract a very large, amongst one of the largest, loves or likes from the public. So it is interesting. I think the voice of critique is important. I don't believe that as a whole, as an architectural professions, we use the intelligent voice to talk deeply about architecture. That perhaps is a critique of where we are at, but we certainly has gone much better than we were a few years ago.
Rory, you're nodding your head there. Did you? What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I think, just to continue Anne's point about, perhaps we're not great at the depth, what you referred to, Christine, as the, communicate what we do as architects. That's not what the Instagram's for, is it? That's not what happens. It's where we sort of, you can be fast and fun and silly and make a joke, or be serious and focus on something that you want to bring to the surface. And to your point about Robin Boyd, the master communicator from the 1960s and 70s, is that he would have loved it. It's like direct into the veins, ideas, images, direct and to your audience. So that's the bit that I think is fantastic. But it's not a place for being considered.
Well, we have to remember that there's probably a 1 to 3 second.
Yeah, that's right. But also
the-
you can bring ideas to the surface that would otherwise be buried in a book or a magazine.
Yeah.
And I think that's the most powerful thing, is to force, it requires a different language, it requires a different sense of attention, and to be able to cut through in that very crowded and short attention span environment. It can be a great way to talk about ideas in the same way that we've talked on the radio to non-architects and so on. So I think it's all part of that continuation. Yeah.
And if we could stay on that idea of idea sharing, I guess, if we talk about that as the topic, and Liam, if I can welcome you into the discussion here as well. You have used film and speculative design to create fictional worlds. And can you briefly tell our audience a little bit, I guess, about Planet City, which is a fictional world created for all of Earth's inhabitants, and how social media platforms may have been a useful tool for either the development and contribution of ideas, or for sharing of ideas?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, probably a lot of people in this room saw Planet City at the Melbourne Triennale last year or a couple of years ago. Times are flat now, isn't it? You guys have probably seen it more often than I have, really. I haven't actually seen it installed at all. I've been locked away here in LA, and it hasn't had its US premiere yet. So its only life has been for me, really, through media platforms. But more broadly, a big caveat around everything I'll say tonight is that although I call myself an architect, I don't make buildings, but rather I would make a claim that architecture exists across a whole range of different kinds of sites, social media being one of them. And I guess I want to make a clear distinction between this idea of social media as being a catalogue of photographs as representations of architecture, and rather I would argue that these images actually become architecture in and of themselves, right? For me, Planet City is a fiction, but at the same time, it's an architecture. It's a series of renderings, I guess, 24 renderings a second constituting a film, but they're not renderings that ultimately need to be expressed physically. They're not renderings that, are an unbuilt competition entry, or that I'm looking for a client to back and build. The point of the project is that the fiction is an endpoint in and of itself. And similarly, I think that to a large extent is some of the value of these social media platforms that we're talking about. It's not about promotion. It's not about cataloging something that we can't go to physically, but actually it's a new kind of site, that we've designed for, and it's a site that has the most extraordinary audience and scale. And if we value the ideas that we talk about as architects, it's kind of negligent of us to not engage with territories that can open up those ideas to as many people as possible.
No, thank you. And I guess in just staying on that thread as well, I guess what role do you see platforms such as, I guess, Twitter, TikTok, or different social media platforms playing in our futures?
And if I can add
go.
to that, because Liam, I mean, obviously Planet City was very well researched, and it was a extraordinary production, and as you describe it, it's a provocation. So, Lewis's point about things like Twitter and TikTok and other platforms, I mean, could they also be useful platforms for provocations? Obviously not at the same level as your incredibly exquisite Planet City, but could we start to think about these as spaces where we might also put forward provocations?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I mean, yes, we scroll past these images so quickly, but I do think there's the possibility for deeper engagement that that can be facilitated for these type of things. I mean, just the sheer amount of time that we spend living out our lives in flickering screens means that there is value in the types of spaces and architectures we construct within the thickness of those screens. You know, in many ways, I think these digital media weigh as much as their physical counterparts, and it's no longer possible to just kind of understand a building or even ourselves without understanding the digital shadows that we cast. We're no longer just our physical selves, but we're also this digital projection. I mean, Kate and I, Kate runs Unknown Fields with me, we tell this story about Chernobyl. We went there a few years ago. Ironically, we are going there again. Not physically, but every time we turn on the news, there's some story about this site again. When we were there in headier times, we encountered an amazing group of fans of the video game Stalker. Stalker was made from the meticulous scanning and digital recreation of the sites of the Chernobyl exclusion zone. What we saw was this amazing community that was running through the exclusion zone at night, kind of acting out their game lives inside the physical landscapes of Chernobyl, and the guards who would normally be patrolling the physical area were kind of acting out their roles in the game and trying to track them down and kick them out. So Chernobyl was both a physical place that we were standing in, but at the same time, it was this atomized condition, this sort of mirror site or this sort of proxy landscape that existed across the world in thousands of flickering screens. And to say one of those sites was more real or substantive than the other would actually be selling both of them short. To really understand Chernobyl, you have to understand it as both of those conditions. It is a landscape that has been photographed a billion times. It's also a landscape that is a physical condition that a bunch of people are now stuck in, trying to stop another meltdown at gunpoint. So I guess this may be a long bow to draw, but I'm trying to make an argument that yes, media is a site of provocation, but it's also a site of inhabitation. And we can experience space in the same way that we can wander through the halls of a building. And I think we need to acknowledge it in those same ways, because there are architects who only make work for the sites of media. And I think they're just as legitimate architects as those that might cast concrete and nail timber together.
Absolutely. Lots to digest there, Liam. Rory, if I can turn to you and your role at the V&A Museum in London, where you were there from 2013 to 2020. And that was a crucial time of change with the evolution of social media platforms. And V&A had 1.6 million followers, I believe. And it was one of the most followed museum profiles, in fact.
Is one of the most followed.
It
Yeah,
is,
yeah.
still today. So, I mean, what are your thoughts on the role of social media platform in that space and the capacity to share ideas and how that impacted on the work of the V&A and, you know, beyond just a simple promotional...
No, exactly. I mean, it's sort of amazing to think of the reach that they had, but of course it's behind a vault. You know, it's controlled by these social media managers who take the ideas that you want to promote or that you've been asked to give them, and then they reframe it into this like bland social media language that won't offend anybody. And so they come back to you, yeah, that post, it didn't do so well. And it's like, well, of course it didn't, you know. But I think there's a more fundamental problem here that, like, institutions can't be like people or something. You know, they when they try and be witty, and you would see this sometimes, they would organise, like, the V&A would have a competition with the Natural History Museum. You know, who would win in a fight? And the Natural History Museum says, we're going to fight you with a Triceratops. and the V&A says, yeah, but we've got this, like, this museum of swords. So so we'll kill the Triceratops. And then they go back and forth and everyone laughs, and it's like, well, you know, they try and be witty. So that's the sort of best that you can do as an institution.
Yeah.
I will say, though, one time I did get my hands on the controls, which was thrilling. So I was in Venice doing the Biennale, and, you know, they're on work, and I was meant to be seeing things that we might collect or meeting people and rushing around the Arsenale, the Giardini and whatnot. And they said, well, why don't you do a live tweet or, a live gram of your thing? So, and I couldn't physically post it myself. That was too risky for them. But I was able to take a picture, write a caption, and then text it to the person who's got the real gold phone, the V&A phone, who would then, you know, design it and then put it on. And I did about 20 in a day. It was so much fun because you're just, you know, the stupidest things that you can see, and then millions of people get it in their phone. So I can recommend it.
And back to Robert Boyd's point, it's all about getting it out there and obviously expanding that audience and the outreach. And
that's right, and I think that they were able to let down the official voice because it was my voice, and so they were able to have fun with it. And I think that you know, the medium is the message, and the medium is fun. So if you try and use it too seriously or to promote things, it just doesn't work. Yeah.
And Nicola, to bring you in on the conversation.
In talking about having fun with it.
As a co-founder of the very fabulous Calibre Journal, can you tell us a little bit about why Calibre began and how social media had played a role in collaboration and idea sharing for a journal that is so beautifully considered for the good old-fashioned print format?
Yeah, so Calibre, me, myself, Steph and Lauren started Calibre as we were students. And I think we started it because at architecture school, for those of you who haven't been through it, you are you're churning through ideas and projects. You're almost doing like maybe 2 projects a week. And you present it in class, you get a bit of feedback, have a bit of a chat, and then kind of gets archived. And you're working so hard on these things in these short, sharp bursts, and we felt like no one in the hard copy publication world would take us seriously enough to publish something that, you know, not all these ideas that are coming out are good, but the ones that kind of were. And we wanted to create a platform for us, but also our peers, to kind of put our work up against work of experienced practitioners or international kind of practitioners. And that's where social media came in massively for us, in that no one would really we didn't think anyone would take us seriously, in that we were bachelor students when we began. And, you know, we wanted to do interviews with like Jack Self and OMA, and of course if you send them an email you just go into this like abyss, but if you send them an Instagram DM, then I think this kind of informality that both Anne and Rory have talked about just feels less like a chore to respond to, and you just see this name. It's kind of like Instagram's in some ways this great leveler where everyone's just got the same profile. No one's got like a fancy domain or like email address. It's just, you know, at whoever it is. And we probably had like a 9 out of 10 strike rate with these people that we thought would never speak to us, in, you know, coming back to us and doing a really amazing interview. So we'd be able to put this interview with OMA up against, you know, my 3rd year design project and say, oh yeah, like actually some very similar ideas and things that you're talking about. And I think that evolved with Caliper, but essentially that's what we set out to do and what we still set out to do. And we still use social media in that way, probably more so than from like a promotional perspective.
And I think that's why we have Liam here, isn't it?
That's how we got Liam here as well, just off an Instagram DM too. So, no, incredible. And I think exactly what you're just talking about. It's a great way of mediating sort of the hierarchy of ideas as well. And social media sort of levels out that playing field of, you know, whose ideas are valuable and whose aren't. And I think that's where there is a strength to it as well, in being able to share various ideas from various different people on one platform that goes to the same audience.
Totally, it kind of like democratizes a little bit of who's getting heard.
Who's getting
Obviously, you know, follow account and algorithms play a part in that, but there's no reason why you can't say your piece up against anyone else that's on the platform, which I think is really great.
Yeah, and I think just in staying on this theme of, I guess, social media as a platform, Liam, if I could come back to you for a moment. I guess I'm extremely interested in the impact that social media has on the way that we currently design our built environment, and whether social media could be a tool in the architectural design process. And if we can circle back to Planet City for a moment, in talking about, I guess, it being a bit of a response to the red line on the graph of climate change, do you think that social media has acted as a tool and had a positive impact on spreading news and generating awareness of world issues, and I guess acting somewhat of a way for activism?
I mean, yes. At the same time, it's also a great mechanism for spreading, you know, information about how Bill Gates is putting microchips in our vaccines, and it's an extraordinary mechanism to divide us, right? Like, you know, I mean, no technology is ever a solution to anything, right? Like, all it really does is exaggerate the conditions that already exist. You know, the potentials of the reach of these platforms is both extraordinary and wondrous, and can connect us to information and data sets and ideas that we might never be able to access otherwise. It can also divide us and spread the most toxic forms of ideas, right? Like, we're in a post-truth world, and these platforms are the vessels and the vectors through which these alternative facts or these fictions make their way into our lives. And they're so pervasive and so dominant that, as I mentioned, you know, these fictions constitute a new type of reality. And that is often really scary, as much as it is extraordinary. So, you know, in the same way that, like, I don't know, any technology can be both emancipating and exclusionary, so too can these platforms operate like that. So, yeah, I guess, you know, it's now just an arms race, really, like, who can tell the best kind of fiction, right? At the moment, like, I mean, here I am, you know, on front row seats for the American apocalypse, and, you know, fictions of hate and fear are much more pervasive than fictions of hope. You know, we're systematically having our futures stolen away from us. You know, as a futurist or a speculative architect, like, it's pretty hard to operate right now when all signs point to the fact that we won't have any kind of future. Perhaps the most radical position we can put out into the world is that there may actually be a world left to listen to our little tweets and Instagrams. I'm straying from your point, but yes, I think, you know, I use the phrase kind of data dramatization, right? Like, we all know that we're fucked and that the graph is rising and the world is getting hotter. Yet, you know, the power of story, the power of pervasive media allows us to dramatize those conditions and connect us to them in ways that, you know, sitting back passively and you know, we can just let it wash over us. So I think, yes, there's potential there, but at the same time, we need to understand it as being like an extraordinarily fraught place that we can tell different kinds of stories that we may not want to.
I think we've certainly all witnessed that firsthand over the last few years. The ugly certainly showed its head in all kinds of forms. But I mean, recently, well, relatively recently, we did have a good news story about an architectural activism around, well, I think it's a good news story, around Federation Square. And Anne, I'd like to talk to you about this because you worked at Lab Architecture in the early days, early parts of the design of Federation Square, one of our major public spaces in this city. And the Yarra building, which is one of the buildings of Federation Square, was recently under threat. It was going to be replaced with a ginormous Apple store, and there was a very big campaign around that due to the lack of consultation or any sort of community engagement in that decision making. And it was of great success. The building is now, it's still there. But more importantly, it was an opportunity for the general public to have a voice about their city, about our built environment, about a very important public space. And social media was an important tool in that campaign. And I wondered if you could talk to that. And, you know, whether or not you think social media might actually be a useful tool in the design process as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It is interesting. First of all, what is interesting too is there has been a number of conversations that those of us who has worked on Fed Square, and there are multiple hundreds of people had these conversations with Peter Davison and Donald Bates as well. Donald Bates has made his position very clear in terms of the new building as a piece of architecture, as a piece of elements within the ensembles of Federation Square. He talked about a continuum of Federation Square, so I respect his, absolutely respect his position. The issues here is, let's put the architecture aside and put the elements within the ensembles of these major cultural urban precincts aside. And that is, the fact is that the public didn't know the issues about transparencies in governments, the issues about transparency, and also to the contributions by public and their thoughts. That's where social media is actually potentially could be a very interesting platform to say, why hasn't the government, various authorities, include the public in these discussions? Understand the point of view and how do you actually use their point of view, be able to make an assessment on the sentiment. I also happen to know that there are platforms and projects, major projects within cities that uses special platform that you have to be part of a community to voice your concern. There is so one of the positive things is, for instance, there was a school, it's a building in Sydney, and it's called I'm trying to remember. It's partly is I know that one of my colleagues was involved in. What was interesting too is the school. It was the acceptable reuse potentially of a brutalist building in the north of Sydney. And so what happened also too is it was actually led by a very, very, the school is it's called Linfield Learning Village. Principals with a particular vision of wanting to drive a very radical, interesting proposition to shape a school. They created a platform using Mind Mixer as a platform to actually start to harness the community around it to say, look, how do you feel and how do you, it's a very careful campaign through Mind Mixer. Everyone who registered within that platform must state who they are in terms of an email and also the date of birth. So you are traceable. So you can participate in this platform. It's a platform with a boundary to state your concerns about education, about what type of education it is, why this particular site, who has a historical role, a brutalist, not quite well loved as a building, why should it remain and why should be adopted to be used by as a special alternative schools. Now, this campaign went on. It was so successful that the Department of New South Wales, the Department of Education, have to listen to the voices from everyone and to make an assessment. Now, this Linfield Learning Village turned out to be one of the most successful radical schools within the New South Wales public system. So it is the case of how do you engage the public, what sort of campaign you use, what questions do you prompt, and how do you engage a mindful, willful, and intelligent conversations in the public? The publics are very intelligent, and within a close and term of when there's a clear reference, the arguments and counter arguments. It's interesting, it's decisive, it's interesting, and it's intelligent. So this is perhaps how public opinions can be shaped by very, very careful campaigns via social media.
And
I mean, well, go
I
ahead,
was just
Nicola.
going to say, and I think on that as well, there's that instance where it is this campaign that someone's spearheading and, making quite a strategic way of trying to save this building, but then on I guess again, a more informal level, I think people are becoming a lot more cognizant about what people are capturing, like the general public are capturing on social media. And I think Lewis made a interesting example in a talk that I listened to recently, where that, historically when people would go to places in cities, they would take photos in front of kind of the top 5, tourist attractions of that place, say. And typically, they're monuments or something of the like. And I think that shaped the narrative of that kind of place. Whereas now I think people don't do that so much. They take photos in front of, bars and laneways and graffiti and art and that kind of thing. And that is actually shaping the place. And that, I think, in a lot of ways is being picked up by architects, city builders, urbanists, planners, and that's actually giving them a much clearer kind of sense of public opinion in the way that they design and things that they, might put forward. And it's not so as clear as genuine public consultation, but it is this kind of underground kind of sense of what the public care about at a time and the general narrative of a place.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot more importance getting placed on public opinion as we just discussed. And I mean, this might sound crazy, but could we foresee a world where all public architecture or all new buildings are required to have a social media profile that allows a space to harness opinion and to harness, I guess, public scrutiny, whether it be internet trolls or intellects? And then, I guess, who would be in charge, or who do we see being the person that would filter those opinions for architects as well?
Or should they be filtered?
Or should they be filtered? Or should we let it rip?
I mean, Rory, what are your thoughts on this? You've written a lot on alternate forms of practice and speaking to the community and...
Maybe Rory, if you could introduce the book as well, just a little bit as well. Architects After Architecture, and I guess it's premise.
Exactly. So Architects After Architecture, it's really about people who studied architecture who then do other things, they go after, and trying to welcome those people back into the fold and to consider what they do as being legitimate. So someone like Liam, not a real architect, obviously, but we ought to call him, we ought to say no, he is. Another example is somebody like Miriam Bellard, who, I'm just thinking of your example of the guys running around in Chernobyl, Liam. Hi, by the way, I haven't seen you for ages. Nice to see you there. Miriam Bellard, who is the head of environment design for Rockstar Games. She's so Grand Theft Auto, this kind of thing. She studied architecture in New Zealand. She now makes these basically game levels that literally tens of millions of people play every day, and nobody's heard of her name. She's the Frank Gehry of the digital world, and we invited her to give a talk in New York at Pratt, and she said, "This is so great. I've never been invited to give a talk in an architecture school before." Somebody who's having so much influence and impact in that way. But just to come back to your point there about should buildings have Instagram accounts? Should it be a form of like public democracy? Should we be able to do a thumbs up or a thumbs down type thing? And does that help us to decide whether we keep it or demolish it or whatever? I'm a bit worried about this kind of thing.
Well, we did have a recent very public announcement of a major project. But yes.
Yeah, and your question about who moderates the comments. I've heard of a project recently where the organisation who posted the pictures was going through and deleting any negative comments. So it looks like everyone loves it. And actually, it's quite sinister manipulation. But equally, when I've been asked, for example, to be on a jury where you don't visit the buildings, but you just look at the photos, I'd normally say no, because I can't judge the building there. It's not real. It's like it exists in that space, but it's too kind of
curated,
cruel to pass a judgment on somebody when you've not actually visited their building.
Yeah.
I guess we're thinking, though, to flip it on its head a little bit, though, we're thinking of, I guess, built architecture having a profile after it's been created. If we could incorporate a profile into the architectural design process before it has been built, I guess to take on public opinion and scrutiny before we actually get to the point of reaching a final design, could it be useful in those stages to actually amplify marginalised voices that wouldn't usually have a say, and more act as a platform there?
And a good example of this actually is the Mayor of London's project called Crowdfund London, which is something that I worked on. To be really basic, who decides what to build in the city are people who have power or money, right? And if you don't have either of those things, you don't get to do a new thing. So that's sort of unfair. And so the project Crowdfund London was about trying to, I guess, redress that balance. So if you're a community group and you wanted to build a new, youth centre, then you could apply to the Mayor's fund for money. And if you were able to demonstrate through, local support or letters of support, and that you actually had the community on your side to do this, then you could. The money that you had would be matched by the Mayor's money. So that was a way of, I guess, giving another platform to positively endorse things that we want to happen in the city. That's the other thing about our current systems, is that we've got lots of instruments for opposing things. We don't have very good instruments for encouraging things. Yep. So I think social media can play a huge role in that. Yeah.
Liam, I can see you nodding there. Have you got anything to add to Rory's comments on that?
No, I'm nodding, I think, because he said it quite well. What can I add, just because you've unmuted me? I don't know. I mean, I think, what we're talking about is engaging the public. I mean, I guess my entire practice as being a non-architect, thanks, Rory, is about trying to engage the sorts of audiences that don't show up at the Capitol Theatre or buy one of our books, and these media platforms are really critical in doing that, because oftentimes, like in circles, like in the art world that we might operate in, or certainly in architecture, in certain schools or wherever, like the word accessible is kind of a derogatory term you might level at someone like Bjarke Ingels, right? And I'm the first person to pile on Bjarke, to be honest. But him aside, being accessible, I think, is a really critical thing that we kind of need to be doing. Otherwise, we're just screaming into the void. We're just rumbling around in the same echo chambers, making work for each other and our friends, and finding the conduits through which we can bring different kinds of audiences into the work that we might be doing at all of its stages, I think, is a really critical act. In many ways, I think it's one of the most defining acts of our generation of designers is to find ways to be more accessible and to be more open and to be more generous. And I think what we're seeing is that the sorts of mediums that we might operate through as architects, traditionally like a plan and a section, aren't necessarily the sorts of things that play well on these platforms, right? And what it means is that we're finding new forms of communication and new types of visual languages through which to communicate our ideas. Because I've said this before, but we might train for 7 years as an architect to really understand and develop a literacy for a plan and a section or a diagram. But there's a literacy and a fluency through which people consume images, consume stories, or in my case, consume fictions. And these are mediums that are native to the social media realm. So I really think that the dominant tools of the discipline are starting to evolve with the ways that people start to consume and understand ideas about space and the world around them.
And what are your thoughts on that? How things are playing out at Hayball?
Yes, it is very well said, of course, from Liam. What is interesting too is the whole idea of, first of all, architecture doesn't actually need to be consumed by the thing or the objects of architecture. And it is about the feel, broad feel. In fact, it's probably one of the best training a young person can have through architectural studies and the broad field of architecture. What is important is to say, even as practices, as colleagues of practices, and also as competitors of practices, we are watching everyone's means and device of communication tools in order to explain both the thinking process as well as the experience process. I like to use the word intangibles and attangibles. The tangibles are the thing that's being produced by finance and power. The intangible is something that you cannot grapple, you cannot go there, physical, but it's spatial. It's just not physical. The two things are very important, and I think all practices more so are discovering, collaborating, working with, getting deep into these, working with architectural artists who has a different way to express in order to create that communication channel. And there's also an interesting thing is, do we, from our young people, go back, have we actually show those literacies around spatial thinking and architectural thinking and broad architectural contributions towards the built environments and the place and what it is as well. So those literacy needs to build in from very early stages.
Nicola?
From an education perspective, teaching over the last couple of years, so as kind of off the tailcoat of Caliper, we started teaching a design elective which focused around kind of publications and independent publishing and content creation and even events and everything you need to do to kind of, I guess, build a culture around this publication. And we started teaching this at the start of 2020, and we all know what happened then. Everything went digital. So, we're all excited to teach this subject that's specifically about a physical outcome, which it was not possible really for this to be a physical outcome, which, silver lining ended up being a really interesting experiment in how you can actually distill that knowledge in various digital platforms. And in that case, the students were really interested in looking at kind of website development. So they all went off and developed their own websites, which became these versions of their publications. But in some of the other classes I was teaching, the students chose to use Instagram accounts, or at Melbourne Uni, they were using this kind of digital environment platform where you would have to, it was very meta, you'd have to walk in, like design your own space to then exhibit your work within. And I think definitely for, at the end of a semester you have an exhibition and you invite your friends who don't know anything about architecture and your parents who don't really know that much about architecture, and they come and they look at all this stuff on the wall and they're like, I have no idea what that is, and just, well done, you've done a good job, move on. And we felt that when we actually moved to the digital realm and it was websites, Instagram, like all those people all of a sudden could kind of understand and grapple with what we were doing, because it was in a medium that was I guess, like familiar to them. And I think that was really interesting for us in that all of a sudden you open these floodgates to, like, as Liam said, you're outside of your echo chamber and you have people contributing to conversations and ideas that never could actually break through that barrier. And I think that's something really, really important and a huge positive of social media and digital platforms more broadly, that I think definitely will kind of live on into as we move more into the physical again.
And with Caliper, I guess, just staying on that one, I think you've had now 10 issues of print publication. Is that correct? There's been 10?
Oh yeah, almost 10.
Almost 10,
Soon.
okay, almost 10. But I guess, how do you see the relationship between print media and social media for Caliper's content and vision moving into the future?
Yeah, well, I think, well, to be honest, Steph, Lauren and I, who founded it, have kind of stepped into a more advisory and mentorship role, and the current editors are really good at social media, so much better at social media than we were when we were kind of at the helm. And I think for them, it's such a strong communication tool in actually communicating the ideas of the magazine via like animations and videos, and they're all so apt at that now because their last 2 years of uni have been, you know, not presenting on paper anymore, and it's, well, how do you actually engage the audience through a screen? We all know, like, Zoom fatigue and all of that. And they've, been able to use the platform really successfully to actually engage a lot more people to submit. And again, it's that accessibility thing. It's not just architecture or designers even submitting, it's people in realms far broader than that because they're just kind of engaged by this little tidbit that they've designed, which is really exciting.
It's the little tidbit that I think is right. Like it's changed. Posting on Instagram has changed the way that I write, because I'll write 2,000 words for Architecture Australia, and it comes out 3 months later, and you never get any feedback. Like, that's it. It just goes into the void. I mean, of course, it sits on people's desks. Someone reads it. Mostly, they look at the pictures. But I'll now really focus on like one killer paragraph, which I know when it prints, I'll take a photo of that and I'll put that on Instagram, and then I'll get all the feedback and the comments that my fragile ego was desperately craving.
I did see
So
that
true.
recently, and I was like, Rory, that
Takes
is
half an hour to
genius.
do a
Good
post.
sentence.
Yeah. So somehow it's like only that one paragraph matters now. That's what the sort of pathetic writers I've become.
But I mean, if you can nail the paragraph, right? It's
Well, that's
like
right.
huge,
You spend a
it's
long
good.
time on that one paragraph.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Exactly.
it was really
It's
good.
very
yeah.
true.
All right, amazing. Well, I think social media has allowed us, as we've just discussed, to share ideas more broadly outside of our career titles. And I think this has only allowed for wider collaboration and broader sharing of ideas. Rory, again, I think I just want to look to the book. We sort of talk about the archaic structures of the architecture profession, whereby the architect is a sole hero. In a world where we now have marketing-led profiles like we sort of touched on before, for buildings and architecture practices, how do we begin to differentiate between an architectural designer versus an online curator?
Oh. I mean...
And what is the difference of the two roles? I mean, as we touched on before, when we're talking about the V&A Museum as well, I mean, the profile, I guess, is less focused on what the building looks like itself, and I guess more about the ideas and the events that are taking place within.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I'm not sure I know the difference, but and it's partly because I think architecture is too slow for social media. That's in a way what makes it so great and interesting, and it's forced a different form of communication. It's like if you only posted once every 2 years when you actually finished a building and you had it photographed, it would be a really boring account to follow. So then you're forced to like show other things. And actually, it's the other things that are really interesting, not the finished photos, but the work. This hashtag WIP is
Work in progress.
Work in progress, and it's the sort of excuse to share something which is half-baked or that you wouldn't otherwise publish. It would never be sent to a magazine, but you can just see something interesting on your desk, snap it, hashtag WIP. No explanation, no further explanation necessary.
Nothing else required.
And you're contributing then to come back to your original question, Christine, does it help us to communicate what we really do as architects. And I think because of the slowness of architecture, it forces us to expand that design time and to expand the tools that we use to reach an outcome and not just show the outcome. And I think, and that's, for me, that's an inversion of the normal critique of social media, is that it turns everything into surface. It's only superficial. It's only the best things that you can follow, you know, or it's not real life. But actually, work in progress is real life, much more than what you would otherwise see in a magazine or the finished product. So I think that in that stretched space is where the reality can come in.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that, but it's so true. I mean, we all grew up looking at the polished image and we never got to see that process. Sometimes you might be able to read about it or you might hear an interview, but now we can actually
you see it in real
watch
time.
that process.
I think that being said though, only a few architects actually take the opportunity to share like genuine process. And I think, and this is just my perception as a person on Instagram, but you know, I think broadly speaking, like Instagram's been a very good illuminator of the architects that take themselves way too seriously and like won't. And I think
never a problem,
we all
surely.
we all know that most architects take themselves way too seriously. Speaking as an architect myself, but you know, I think Instagram's been a really great way to kind of understand like architects with personality versus architects that maybe don't have a personality so much. And I think
Harsh.
It's true. I'm not saying anyone on this stage, but it's just like, I think it's been a really interesting, it's a really interesting thing to see which architects actually get it right in that they share genuine process and things that actually really engage, you know, and clearly engage beyond a marketing agenda. And I think that's a really, like, that constitutes like an amazing architectural Instagram for me, is when you can see that there is like the marketing stuff, because you would be crazy to think that there's not that. And I mean, I'm now a marketing manager. I know exactly what that means and how, you know, important it is for a business and a brand. But at the same time, being able to feed in that informal and really exciting, I guess, content, which I think is actually the thing that keeps people going back to your profile. And then all of a sudden they see a finished image of like a building you've just done. They're like, oh wow, that's amazing as well. But
It's only taken us 9 years, but
yeah, exactly. But you don't know that, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Amazing. Public questions, if we could move into as well, if we're going to scoot into that. We're going to ask the audience if you've got any questions that you'd like to direct at the panel as well, and so we can bring a microphone around, and so please do raise your hand.
I think I've got one of the roaming mics.
You've got one of the roaming mics? Okay, perfect. We've got one.
Another one up there.
One over there as well. Okay. We've got one up the very back there.
One back there.
Hello.
Lewis, amazing job, and the rest of the panel, amazing to hear your views. I kind of didn't think this fully through before the microphone was flown up here. But I guess we've talked about so many different topics. We talked about the end of the world from Liam. We've talked about democratization of spaces and of conversation, activism, disinformation, misinformation, and I guess how social media changes up the way we explore spaces, architecture, and time as well. And all those things are sort of raveled up together. But my question is, what's sort of the net outcome or effect of our sustained engagement with social media in this way? Is it you talked about languages, changing fluency and things with expanding platforms and so on. What do you see happening to us, the public, if that made sense?
Who would like to take that one? It was a great...
Well, that's for you, Louis.
That must be me.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a hard question to ask. Does anyone else want to lead in at all?
Not me.
So just to clarify, so the question is, what is the outcome of, I guess, everything we've discussed tonight for the general public in architecture? Is that... Yes? I don't know. I don't have the answer to that. There's no solution there.
I think it is a form of... to take the sinister end of the question, somebody like Nathan Jurgensen, who's a fantastic critic of social media and its effects on how it shapes how we live, would say that it's a form of social control that we use to control each other, right? So getting likes is great. It encourages you. It tells you to do more of that. But when you don't get them, it's sort of like, well, don't do that again. You know, and so we change our behaviour based on the feedback that we get, and that's sort of really sad because it makes us all conform or something. And I don't think and I worry that I mean, the opposite is probably true. Encourages us all to be more extreme versions of ourselves as well. And then what's the parallel to architecture, I would ask, and that maybe that is that we, you know, focus exactly like your thesis did, actually, Louis. We focus on the fixed point perspective, and it doesn't matter what's happening around the back; it's all falling over.
Yeah.
You know, and so it only counts what sticks to the lens, because that's all that we will see.
I mean, as well, I guess the response to that as well is for our architecture, it results in the fact of we're designing for the final shiny image. I mean, I think architecture practices are now designing for the hero shot and what's going to appear in a magazine or what's going to be presented online, rather than, I guess, the importance of what that building actually needs to be. And this is where it's a positive and a negative, because I mean, social media can act as a real platform to, you know, harness opinion and amplify voices, but at the same time, social media is also the cause of why we're designing buildings to look a certain way as well. So I guess that is, a bit of the implication that it has on society. Got another question here as well, and then one up the front.
Yeah, following on from that, what's everyone's opinions on? It was mentioned earlier, some architects post on Instagram a lot, some don't, and then our ideas of them have formed through that. So especially with residential, what's your opinion on designing a home or a building for that perfect shot, and then everything else is kind of forgotten, or form doesn't follow function, it's just for the gram and the beautiful materials, and then is the essence of why we do architecture anyways, is that lost?
Well, I feel sorry for anyone that's living there, first of all. If it's only designed for the perfect image, but does anyone take the...
Yeah, I think what is important is there are a lot of poor quality, shall we say, let's just say unintelligent words that is actually developed for, shall we say, a profit, and also for the unknown users. So the questions really is, and during a boom time, there are a lot of developers and those who actually want to make fast money out of the built environment. The questions really is, the ethos of the architects or the architectural practice that take on the work is, what ethos do you put in? How do you actually advocate and use evidence-based approach for really good, richly conceived places for living, and why? And actually discuss this, talk about it, and imbue that knowledge and process. Describe it to the outside world, why this is good, why would this be enduring, why would this actually make a good place, how do you read quality and good design. So it's advocacy, advocacy through an evidence-based approach towards places of living. It's very important. And admittedly, there are multiple types of very bad developments, and we are seeing the legacy of a city that, I hate to say that, really, really bad in some parts. And they're going to be staying there for 30, 40 years. And we just need to see these clusters that is existing in some part of the city.
And I think to stay on that, with residential architecture as well, I think developers have used, I guess, the idea of an Australian dream to push through imagery. I guess poor developments as well. We've used the Australian dream of a 3-bedroom home, large living spaces and a big backyard to create that perfect image, and that's, I guess, what's happening to our residential landscape now as well.
I don't know if I'm on mute or not. Hello?
No, you're there.
I would jump in here just with a little word of caution. I don't know, like, I think it's a little bit of a fallacy, the idea that, like, there are a bunch of architects out there like that don't give a shit about people and that are going to occupy their buildings, and they're just constructing the building for an image. Like, I don't think Instagram has changed that, in that there's always been architects that have like constructed a drawing and were more interested in the form of a drawing than they were the form of a building. And you make your plan a certain way, even though no one's going to see it, because it makes sense in the context of the drawing. Or I'm sure people, made architecture so it could be painted in a particular way. Like, I don't think this is like some radical new phenomena that means that, everyone's just making Insta-ready architecture. I mean, I think we're mindful of how a building might be lensed more often now, but that means that someone might rearrange the furniture in a particular way to take a photograph, or buy a nice blanket and drape it across a chair because it looks kind of casual and informal, and that plays well on the grams. Like, yeah, I don't know. I mean, maybe this was the point of your entire project, Luis, and there is this deep research and catalogue of arsehole architects that are just making images of buildings now, but I don't think so. So I think it's influential for all the reasons we're talking about, but I would just caution the doomsayers that are saying like, we're just making images now.
Thank you, Liam.
I'm
I think that's a really
the
important point. And it is a long
but
process, and you build a relationship with the clients, and yeah.
No, and Walter Burley Griffin obviously designed this for Instagram, didn't he? This ceiling in 1926.
Very fitting location.
Insta shot.
Yeah,
But he also
Like,
did some, magnificent houses, in Castle Craig, as well, right? That is about living, very much about living in a landscape.
Mm.
Yeah. And he's unashamed about the idea of ornamentation,
yeah, that's right.
because it is enlivening. It does something to the sense of the human mind. It's pleasurable.
Yeah,
And
the
is
most,
there anything wrong with being pleasurable?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think anyone would have walked into this space today and gone like, oh, I wish the ceiling was a bit more basic.
yeah.
Except the cleaner.
Yeah.
I think Timothy had a...
I've actually got a young critic next to me who wants to say something, and I think what's good about Instagram, you come for the thirst trap and you stay for the deep discourse. But I've got a 6-year-old critic here who wants to say something.
I like selfies because you can see yourself in a certain pose.
Very
Amazing.
good.
Amazing.
That's great.
I like selfies because you can see yourself. Hi, sausage.
All right, well, thank you very much. I think, do we have any more questions there that we want to ask? One at the back?
Hello. I just wanted to ask what you think the rise of augmented reality and sort of virtual reality will have in physical cities. I worry that if they become as ubiquitous as smartphones are today, we might sort of neglect the physical part of our cities.
Right.
Who did you want, Liam, to answer that one?
Yeah.
Or?
Yeah.
I mean, what's kind of interesting about today, like every panel I've been on for the last 6 months has just been a metaverse feast. Like, I don't know, but Australia is often a little bit behind the times, I guess. But like, it's just metaverse constantly. NFTs and metas and all of that, and really what we're talking about is, when we're talking about the metaverse, is just the extension of these platforms that today we're talking about as Twitter and Instagram. Like, very soon these systems are going to leave the screen and start to become spatial, and the metrics through which we define and imagine images, like resolution, bandwidth, are going to become metrics through which we start to understand space. When mediums leave the screen, become physical, then all of a sudden the logics of the screen start to become the logics of space. So I don't know if anyone else wants to dive in on metaverse. I'm kind of sick of talking about it to this point, but what I think is interesting with something like VR or AR, and speaking as someone who's now making films, VR is not a filmic medium; it's an architectural medium. The best way to understand VR as a phenomena is through the language of architecture. There's no such thing as an edit in VR, right? Like, there's no such thing as a cut. what there is thresholds. There's portals. There's trajectories, and it's the people who really have scope over creating media in that territory, I think, are architects. As Rory described and talked about, one of the architects of the landscapes of video game. I mean, I run an entire master's program here in LA, kind of essentially helping architects evolve out of traditional forms of practice into video game designers or immersive media artists who work through VR and AR and game because it's an inherently spatial medium. So, if today we're talking about the ways that architects are embracing social media, then I think that's only going to become more extreme and more natural as that media starts to become more spatial, and we don our augmented reality contact lenses and wander around the Zuckerbergian metaverse in some kind of post-capitalist fever dream. Scary and wondrous days ahead.
I think in a less kind of dystopic kind of example with our ACCA project as well, we kind of started experimenting with AR in that the current Caliper editors were really keen to start, playing with it and seeing how it could complement the physical space. And so the physical space was a library and a reading room, and the idea of the space was that the public could kind of reconfigure it and move all the furniture around in certain configurations that then led to particular interactions in the space. But we kind of realised that we hadn't really told anyone how to do that, and so we used AR in that case via an Instagram filter where you could go into the room, scan a QR code, it would take you straight to Instagram, then like a diorama of our room would pop up that you could then zoom in to make like a big perspective, like you're in the room, or you could just look at it like it was a little model in your hand, and that actually cycled through all the different ways that you could use the space in the room. And so kind of without having that AR complementing the physical space was a little bit confusing in some ways. And so it was really important to have those two things working hand in hand, and I think there'll always be a place for the physical, but it's kind of how can the digital actually complement that and enhance the experience of that, which is something I think everyone's kind of doing a bit more now.
Yeah, and just to add to that, this technology is being used first and most of all in the sort of bottom end of the market, and I think that's what's so interesting and exciting about it. The big home builders are already way onto this. They understand that it's a great communication tool. You can go into an enormous shed out in the suburbs, and they'll have a digital plan on the screen, and they'll project it from the ceiling so that you can then walk around on it and see exactly how big the rooms will be, and then resize it in real time. What a fantastic service. But they're only offering that for suburban, bottom of the market tract homes. The architects in this room are not doing that. So I think it's super interesting where the leading is happening.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, indeed. And ultimately, it's the communication tools to provide a sense of literacy of the spaces that you're engaged in. And certainly, as practice, we use various forms of the AI as well as the way to deal with VR. It's very commonly used, but one should actually go in once again with a sense of care and seriousness as well. It's great to be able to experience it. Ultimately, is you actually want that literacy and understanding of the space and be engaged in the real life. Yeah.
Exactly.
It's a way to get across the idea.
It's accessibility.
It's accessibility
for
indeed.
the general public. Yeah.
I think that's a great thought to end on, and I would like to welcome you all to thank our marvellous panel this evening.
And thank you as well, RMIT, the NGV curatorial team as well, for letting us host this amazing event. And thank you all for joining us tonight as well in the Capitol Theatre under this nuclear green ceiling. Don't forget to take a selfie on the way out in the spirit of all things as well. But yeah, we would like to extend a huge thank you. Thank you, Liam. Thank you, Nicola. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Rory. And thank you, Christine, as well.
And super big thanks for you for organising it. Great.